For those of you that might be new here, my name is Megan Mountain, and I am the Director of Partnerships here at Wealth Factory. And today we have the amazing team at Engineered Insurance Services joining us. And we'll be discussing how business owners can fully leverage the value and protections available through workers' compensation insurance. We invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and so we want it to be as interactive as possible. We want to make sure we get all of your questions answered. And we'll also leave a few minutes at the end for additional Q&A. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming. We have Andrew, Mick, and Matt. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
for having us.
Yeah, so I'll pass it off to you. And again, any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask. Mick, the floor is yours.
All right, so we are definitely going to make this very interactive today. So don't hold back on any questions, comments, or anything at all. Our intent is to make sure that when we leave this session today, that everyone feels comfortable, a little more knowledgeable, but most importantly, understands the cost savings that you have with workers' comp. So I asked Megan to ask the question of, when we think about workers' comp, what limit do we have, right? Because all of us or most of us have a workers' comp policy, and we usually see that limit of like $1 million. And I forgot who had put that number in there, but we usually see that number of $1 million or $500,000. And then we also had someone that said none. So what I want you to know when we talk about employee medical care, when we talk about rehabilitation and all those things, there actually is not a limit um, on your policy for that. When you see that $1 million limit, that $500,000 limit, that's considered the employer liability piece. So if you're negligent to something and were to get sued, that's where that limit comes into play. And most of the time when I'm talking to customers and prospects or business owners about comp, that becomes an eye-opening moment for them because insurance agents typically haven't explained that in that manner of there's actually no limit on the medical costs, the rehabilitation, the injury. There's no limit to that. And so I always want to make sure that I'm educating business owners so that we can make better decisions about limits, and I'm using air quotes, limits that we have. So our team at Engineered Insurance Services, along with Wealth Factory, created this workbook, this playbook that we're going to give to you all at the end of this to help you understand workers' comp from the buyer perspective or from the business owner perspective. And I promise you, I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence, and we're not just going to read this playbook or this workbook line by line or word for word. But there are things that I do want to highlight that I feel like are important. And again, anytime that there's a question, there's a comment, don't hesitate to put that in there. But what's inside of this workbook, and I'll kind of go through the table of contents as well, but we're going to talk about what workers' comp covers, debunk some myths that most business owners have. What are some cost control strategies that we have? Because if I were to tell you of all the insurance policies that you should have, the one that you actually control pricing on is workers' comp. That's the one policy that you can control your spend, believe it or not. And I work with several enterprise level clients where when they become a client of mine, I've gotten checks in the high six figures for them. I have one business that year one with me, we were able to get back over $600,000 of what they had been overpaying for workers' comp. So that should let you know the amount of control that you have. And I would honestly say, and this isn't me saying it just to say it, this is validated by, the insurance world. 93% of worker comp policies have some type of incorrection in them. And that's why, I was very successful at getting money back for my clients because there's usually an error. Not purposely, it's just you have to know what you're looking for. And so this playbook or this workbook is going to help you understand the things that you can look for to control pricing. So again, not going to go verbatim through this document, But in each section, there are some things that I want to highlight and give you the opportunity to ask questions to myself, Andrew, and Matt. So, we're going to talk about what does worker comp actually cover? What are some myths? What are some questions you should ask when choosing your insurance company, not the agent, but the actual company or carrier? What are the rating factors? So how is it priced? What are some things that you should look for? And I know a lot of us as business owners, right? What are some cash flow strategies that we should have? And then working with an insurance agent. This isn't for you all to hire us as your insurance agent. This is more to give you insights of questions that you can be asking your current agent or agents in the future so that you are put in the prime position to control your workers' comp. We're going to talk a little bit about audits because the one thing about workers' comp is it is an auditable policy. We'll talk about some claims best practices and then just some overall tips. So that's what we're going to go through. Again, I promise we're not going to read this verbatim. And at any time you have any questions, let's roll. So before I get into, what is workers' comp, I wanted to give you a little bit of my background. So May, I think it was May 15th, don't hold me to it, May 15th of the year 2000, I graduated college from the University of North Carolina. May 16th of the year 2000, I started in an insurance agency. So I literally started my adult professional career in insurance almost 25 years ago. And from day one, workers' comp was my jam. Like workers' comp, cyber liability, and professional liability are the three lines of coverage that I know like the back of my hand and that I care about. So much so that if you were to ask me something about like your commercial auto, that's probably an Andrew or a Matt question, right? Like I don't know those lines of businesses. But, I started out again almost 25 years ago in insurance and kind of became an insurance nerd, but also like a people person. So I was like that random person that could literally talk to you about anything while we're having a glass of bourbon. Just to let you know, like workers' comp is my jam. And so I like to break workers' comp down so that all of us can truly understand it. Right. And so that's what I promise you today. I'm not going to use insurance terminology or anything like that. I really want to make sure that we know the goods of workers' comp. So when we talk about, you know, what is workers' comp, I just want to highlight some of the key benefits, right? So medical coverage, we all get, disability pay, rehabilitation costs, and then death benefits. Not that any of us ever want to have to go through that, but all of that is covered in your workers' comp policy. And so when we talked earlier about what's your limit, and we talked about workers' comp versus employer liability. So when you see a limit on your declarations page or your policy, and it has that number of 500,000 or 1 million, and then you have an umbrella policy that maybe goes above that. What you're actually covering is employer's liability. And what employer's liability is your negligence. So I'll make this scenario up. So, you know, I work for Andrew's moving company, right? And Andrew has a whole bunch of boxes that are labeled heavy. And so I know when I see a box labeled heavy, there's some things I need to do, maybe some equipment I need to get, or, a brace or something that I need to make sure that I have on. But there's this one box that Andrew forgot to label as heavy. And so then I go there and I go lift this box, and now I've got back issues. Workers' comp is going to cover my medical expenses. But because Andrew was negligent in labeling that box, I could also sue him for that. Now, I'm a good person. Andrew's an amazing boss. I would never sue Andrew. However, there are not a lot of me and Andrews out there, right? Like we've seen those employees or those people that apply for jobs and we get those red flags, right? So just so that you know the difference between workers' comp and employer's liability. So that $1 million limit that you see on your policy, that's the limit for me suing Andrew or for one of your employees suing you. Or I'm also going to throw this out there because we see this a lot too. If any of you were in manufacturing, right? and I've got a piece of equipment from your business, right? And I didn't maintain the equipment the proper way. So I didn't clean it thoroughly, I didn't put the right protocols around it. But then that piece of equipment caused damage to me. I could then sue you, right? And because it was worker comp in nature, then the employer liability would cover that as well too. So employer liability is negligence, both for things that I should be looking out for, or if I don't maintain equipment the way that the manufacturer told me to. So those are things that I always like to explain, and that difference between what we think of as the medical component of workers' comp, which has no limit, right? Like I've literally seen cases over 3 years where it's over $5 million of medical claims, right? Right. So there's no limit on that, but there is a limit on the employer liability piece. So when your agent comes in, or if you have a vendor that requires you to have $1 million in workers' comp, truly ask them, are you talking about medical coverage or are you talking about employer liability? Because you can save yourself a lot of money when you explain to them, because most people don't understand or know there's actually no limit on the medical coverages within workers' comp. So I'm going to pause right there and see if we have any questions to answer.
Hey, Mick, thanks so much. So, quick question. So, Brandon was saying that in Alabama, he was assured that if workers' comp is used and they cannot sue his company. So, could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? Maybe it's by state or,
No,
okay,
no, Brandon, that is a great question. You can't be sued for any medical cost. So
okay,
workers' comp is waiving to be sued for medical. You could still be negligent for something and have pain and suffering, or the family of the person injured could have pain and suffering. So you can't be sued for any medical or rehabilitation or disability, but you could be sued for negligence. Great
okay.
question. And I get that 99% of the time, Brendan. Great
Yeah.
question.
Thank you for the clarification there, Mick. And then
Yep.
also for Cole, so Cole is asking, would an umbrella policy cover the employer's liability?
Yes, that's only what the umbrella covers, Cole, by the way, is the employer liability. It
Okay,
doesn't, because there's no limit on the rehabilitation, the disability, the medical coverage. There's no limit to that. An umbrella only covers or goes over the employer liability. And another thing about death benefit, that is given per state. So whatever the death benefit of your individual state is, that's what workers' comp pays out. So, some states are 183,000, some states are 97,000. Like every state has their own death benefit limit. That's what worker comp pays out there.
great. Thank you so much, Mick. I appreciate you answering those questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great questions, Megan. You were right. This is an awesome group. I love it. So, again, just wanted to make sure we highlight those key differences. Again, not going to read this verbatim. You can all kind of see, like, we're smart enough to understand what happens without workers' comp. So, I'm not going to deep dive into that, but we do have some examples, some real world applications of things that Andrew, Matt, and I have seen. So we wanted to put them in here so that you're not just getting fluff, you're getting things that we actually do. So when we get down to this page of what does workers' comp cover, and I really want to highlight a couple of things here that are really important, especially as we're in this, I don't want to say more modern world, but just as life has changed for us as humans, right? So obviously, I think we understand accidental injuries, occupational injury, but here's some things that are new. So I shouldn't say new, but this we're not aware of, and I wanted to put here. So repetitive stress injury. So, a lot of times people think, oh, well, I don't do anything physical at work, right? I have admins, or, we are service industry and we're behind the desk a lot. We're professional service. Well, repetitive stress, things like carpal tunnel, tendonitis, things that build up over time, most likely in the court of law are going to get pushed back to what happened at work, right? My mother is a perfect example of this. Because I'm her son, she didn't file a workers' comp claim, right? But for 35 years, My mom was the head of DMV in the state of South Carolina. She's on a typewriter computer literally all day for 35 years. Well, because of that, she's developed tendonitis. The last 5 years of her employment before she retired, she wore a sleeve, right? Well, her doctor, when she was going to retire, said, hey, you do know that repetitive stress is something that you can attribute to work, and maybe you should consider filing a worker comp claim. Now, my mother is my mother, so she knew better and she didn't file a claim. But what I want you to understand is that when your employees are going to doctors, they understand this is in the policy. These are the things that they're advising people. So if we know that people are being advised of this, there are things that we can do to help alleviate things, right? So again, whatever preventative maintenance or preventative things that you can do are things that you want to put into place. And then the last one that I have there is really big because this is something that in the last 5 years, like literally right before COVID, started becoming a coverable issue in workers' comp, which is mental health. So now it's mandated federally that mental health is covered under workers' comp. So every state that offers workers' comp, mental health is considered a covered, what we call a covered peril, but a covered issue. So those are things to think about, right? And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I'm a huge mental health advocate. But for me, it allows me to have awareness in my businesses, right? If I know that mental health is something that a claim can be filed on, I want to make sure that as a business leader and as a business owner, I'm doing the right things within the business to make sure that we're addressing mental health. Um, I was literally 3 weeks ago speaking in Atlanta for a global convention, and there was someone, and I can say the name because they're also a client of mine. So American Express literally just went through a big mental health claim. Um, Not a class action lawsuit, but over 100 employees. And it was all covered under workers' comp. And so those are things that we've got to make sure that we're able to understand that that is a covered peril or a covered claim within your workers' comp policy. So when we talk about what's covered, I also want to talk about what's not covered, right? So obviously non-workplace injuries. So if someone's doing something and it had nothing to do with work or on work premises, that's not there. Self-inflicted injuries, right? These are things that your claims adjusters are going to look at and ask a lot of questions around. Was this self-inflicted, or, was this something that was accidental or occupational, right? Employee misconduct won't be covered. And then here's a biggie: your independent contractors. So those 1099s that you have, right? And I'm going to counter this in a second, but most of the time, your independent contractors are not covered under your workers' comp policy, right? So again, on this section, I really wanted to highlight, especially repetitive stress and mental health, are things that I'm seeing policies pay out literally every day now. And then under what's not covered, employee misconduct, and then your independent contractors. So a lot of times people think, oh, well, I've got a salesperson, right, that they're not a W-2 employee. I pay them commission only. Well, they're not covered under your workers' comp policy. Now, again, I'm going to counter that in 5 minutes, but on paper, they're not covered under your workers' comp policy. And I'll pause there for questions.
Hey, Mick. So quick question, great question from Joe. So he's curious in regard to max payout, would it be based on the state that the incident occurred in, or is it the state that the company is based in?
Great question. If we're talking the death benefit question, it is the state of where your employee resides for death benefits, right?
Okay.
When we're talking about the other things, there is no limit, right, to workers' comp, but classifying your employees, and we're going to get to that in a moment. So great question, but classifying your employees by state is critically important because every state has different rates for workers' comp. And again, when we talk about the price that you're paying for insurance. Where I see a lot of errors, this happens a lot, right? Like I'm personally based in South Carolina. I have employees that work in Florida, Texas, California, Ohio, Maryland, and I'm probably missing two other states. I have to list all of their locations to get number one, accurateness of my policy, and two, accurateness of the rates. So great question.
Okay, great. And then question from Brandon. So he's saying workers' comp is based off of payroll, but payroll includes 1099s and they're not excluded. So how does that, do you want to maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, so
Um,
ask the last part of the question again. So
so
payrolls,
I think he's saying that no, workers' comp is based off the payroll, and then payroll includes a 1099, then how are they excluded from workers' comp?
yep. So workers' comp, we want to collect your payroll, right? But when you're classifying your payroll on most applications, and I can have this conversation with your agent if you want to, but there's a question of how much of that payroll is 1099 or contractor payroll, because then that part doesn't necessarily get charged to you under the payroll rate. It
Okay.
is an independent contractor rate, which is a little bit different depending on what your industry is. A lot of times you see this with artists and contractors, right? So we want to make sure that we're classifying anyone that can do work with you on the workers' comp. Now, on your general liability policy, that payroll can totally be charged or counted in your rate. But on workers' comp, it literally is they want to know of your payroll, what's your employee count and
Okay.
your employee payroll, and then what's your independent contractor count and independent contractor payroll. And then we're going to ask a little bit more questions about those independent contractors, right? Like, because just because you list them, Brandon, as an independent contractor doesn't mean you truly treat them independently, right? Like, if you require them to do the same things and have the same accountability as your W-2 employees, the court of law is going to say they're just employees then, and they're going to be treated that way. So when I talked about I'm going to counter myself a little bit, that's
Mhm.
the counter. So when we ask that question on an application, it is truly to understand, okay, here's your W-2 payroll. We've got that. Here's your independent contractor payroll. Now let's find out what are your independent contractors truly doing and what scope of authority do you have over your independent contractors? Meaning, do you make them come in at the same time that your other folks do and leave when they do? Or are they free to come in and out? Right? Do they have their own insurance policy? Right? Those are questions that on the application underwriters are going to want to know, because then they may say, okay, we are going to count this payroll under your total payroll. But just because we ask it doesn't mean that we're actually counting it under workers' comp. General liability, we're going to count it 100% of the time. Great question.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And then so Cole is asking for the 1099 contractors, would the umbrella policy cover them if they were to make a claim under the business or a claim against the business?
Nope. So, Andrew, we get to have the fun insurance conversation that most people usually don't want to hear. And I'm saying this under the premise of love, because we're not insurance carriers, we're insurance agents, right? When you file a claim, the first thing that an insurance company is trying to do is figure out how to not pay that claim, right? Like they're trying to figure out, wait, how do we not pay this claim? So the first thing, if you do have independent contractors, and this is always a sticky conversation, not just in workers' comp, but the other policies as well, is do you require your independent contractors to have insurance? And do they list you as an additional insured under their policy? I'm going to tell you, any of you that use independent contractors or 1099s, I would require them to have their own workers' comp policy, because the insurance company is going to try not to pay this claim. And if you give them a reason, they're going to ask a million questions about the relationship that you have with your independent contractor. They're going to see, we call it in our language a hold harmless agreement. You guys might have seen that with your agent asking you for hold harmless agreements, meaning even if I don't have insurance, I'm holding Brandon, he's held harmless, and I'm not going to file a claim if I'm working on his behalf. So again, my rule of thumb is if I have an independent contractor, they're going to get their own insurance. Andrew, I'd love for you to chime in on that because again, the friction that we always have when it comes to independent contractors is around claims time, right?
Yeah.
It's inexpensive when they come on board because we can just exclude them. But the moment there's a claim, there becomes a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. We've seen those go sideways, and they never go sideways until they do. And when they do, it's typically pretty ugly. On the liability side too, right? You talked about the payroll being included or excluded based on those contracts. But yeah, I think you're right. We definitely push for that, and like we provide our clients with subcontract agreements, which do our best to push that risk off of your entity and onto your contractor's entity. Because I'm sure a lot of your companies are subcontractors for somebody else, and you've signed a million of those agreements that are 20 pages long that all that's doing is pushing everything downhill, right? So unfortunately, you want to continue that and protect your entity as much as possible. So that's something that we work with our clients a lot on.
That's great feedback. And so we've got another question here that kind of ties into this conversation. So are subcontractors treated or should they be treated as independent contractors? So we have an attendee here that says they have 14 employees and about 60 contractors. They all the contractors control their own times of execution and construct, and it's in the construction business. So should they be expected to have their own coverage?
Yes, you definitely want your subcontractors to have their own policies. What I would say, and we will totally do this for free, no charge, and no hidden agenda to try to talk to you or whatever. But what I would say, if you have 60 subcontractors, you might want to look at providing an insurance program for them. And that's just simply stating you're going to help control their insurance by making sure you are listed as an additional insured on their policies with the limits that you need to protect your business, with the right language that you need to protect your business. If you're in the construction industry, it is very common that you, as the business owner or the GC, have a program for your subs, right? And again, you just want to make sure that all of your subs have the limits that you need, that you're listed properly as an additional insured with all the waivers of subrogation, so that then you will never have to pick anything up on your policy. And it totally helps you at the time of audit. And that's just not workers' comp. I would definitely say for you, it's probably more needed on the GL side than the workers' comp side, right? So if you can prove on the workers' comp side that they're their own entity, which it totally sounds like that with 60 subs, and in the construction business, contracting business, totally normal. You don't have to worry about it on the workers' comp side. But on the GL side, you definitely want to make sure that all of your subs have a policy that you're listed. And the best way to do that, I would tell you, is to get with your agent, make them all go to your agent, or at least have your agent review every policy and create some type of annual check period that you don't have to do, but your agent should do, just to make sure that you are totally controlled. And that's something that Andrew, Matt, and I do with every single construction customer that we have, because you're going to see major pitfalls there.
Yeah, that's great. Great feedback. Thank you so much. And whoever that asked that question, if you are interested in something like this, you can always reach out to your wealth architect as well, and they can get you in contact with the team here. So and then one more quick question from Joe. I don't want to hold you up, Mick. I know we've got a few more things to get through, but so going back to when Joe was asking about the state. So if it, which state is it that the incident occurred in, or the state that the company is based in? He's asking, how does this play in the whole work from home trend that we're seeing now? So if you want to elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Yep, Joe, I'm the perfect example of this, right? My entire company is remote. Everyone works from home. And so on my policy, I list, I have I have to choose the states, right? So again, I choose 6 different states. that all of my employees are in, and I put the payroll in that state because every state has their own rate. So in the instance of work from home and remote, you literally have to list on your policy, Joe, like all the states that your employees reside in and what the payroll is in those states as well. But it's to your benefit. It is tedious. Trust me, it's tedious. I go through it every year with my workers' comp as well too. But it totally makes sure that your rates are correct because again, like my employees in Florida, I pay a much different rate than I do for my employees in Maryland, right? Like it's just unfortunately that's how the state of Florida is. But it's really important that you're doing it correctly with remote work. Great question, Joe.
Great. Thanks so much, Mick. Appreciate it.
You got it. And Megan, I'm totally fine if we need to do a part two of this too, because I love the interaction. I'm totally good with getting to where we get to because I like making sure that we answer the right questions. And I
Great.
can talk workers' comp for 20 years. So
Awesome.
there's never enough time for me to talk workers' comp.
Okay. Love that. Thanks so much. Appreciate you.
And you got it. You got it. So again, that's part two of what's covered. Really quickly, I'll bust a few myths. And these are myths that, Andrew, Matt, and I hear on a regular basis. So, workers' comp is only for dangerous jobs. Nope, I can tell you because carpal tunnel happens, slip and falls happen all the time. Again, mental health is a thing now that happens on a regular basis. Myth two, we already busted. There's a limit to workers' comp. Every business that I interact with, that's always the first question that I ask because I don't know why, Andrew and Matt, but like most agencies don't have the conversations that we have. Like that is literally our first question because then we know how good of a job the previous agent or broker has done explaining workers' comp. So we like to educate our partners and we call all of our clients partners on the things that they can control. And so that's where we start there. Um, Independent contractors won't affect my workers' comp policy. So here's where I was going to say, I'm going to counter what I told you. If your independent contractor works like a regular employee and is treated like a regular employee, they're going to count. And we see, again, 60% of independent contractor claims actually get paid because they're treated like employees. Meaning, if my employees come in at 9, my employees have a desk, my employees have a computer, they're going to treat them that way too. Just because, and you see this a lot in sales, just because they're commission only doesn't mean that they're not an employee or treated like an employee. So there's a huge difference in 1099 commission only versus a true independent contractor. And so we see a lot of that go wrong, even in our industry and insurance, where, oh, I've got a salesperson, I'm going to pay them 1099, but you still want them to come in and you still want them to follow your processes and you make them sign a handbook and you give them rules. Well, now they're an employee and the court of law is going to see them as an employee as well. And then Joe and Brandon, we talked about this a lot. So, WC isn't needed for out of state employees. That's a complete myth. Just because they're not in the home state of the business doesn't mean that they shouldn't have coverage. So, no matter where your employees are located, they need to have coverage. And you're going to have to separate state and payroll for each of your employees based on the geographic locations. And trust me, you're going to want that, especially if you're in Texas, New York, California, Florida, Colorado, where workers' comp premiums or rates are higher than other states. You don't want to be based in California, but have employees everywhere and paying California rates for someone in New Mexico or for someone in Oklahoma, right? Like it's a great price break for you when you take the time to list them out. So when we talk about your policy, so again, this is choosing your workers' comp carrier or the policy, right? So this is like a Hartford, a Nationwide, a Liberty Mutual, a Traveler, something like that. What are some things, what are some questions that you want to make sure that you're asking yourself and or the company, right? So what are the requirements of my state? Every state has specific rules, right? Every state has rules, and when I say rules, if I am a 1 or 2 person business, is workers' comp required, right? That's going to vary by every state. In the state of North Carolina and South Carolina, If you have 3 or more employees, including yourself, then workers' comp's required. But every state's different. So you want to know, what are my state requirements on if it's something that I need or not? And then the second one is, does the policy include employer's liability? Again, there's no limit. So sometimes you'll have agents that won't put employer liability on there because there's no limit to workers' comp. Well, we can still be negligent in what we do as business owners. So we want to make sure employer liability is included as well too. So I'll pause there for another subset of questions.
Hey, Mick, so quick question. So Brandon's asking, if he gets a contract and he sends employees to another state, does he have to have a different policy for each state?
If you have a contract, Brandon, and they're working in that state, but it's not permanent, then no, you don't need a different policy for that state.
Okay.
If they reside there and they're going to be there for more than, I'm going to say half the year, right? If they're going to be there for more than 6 months, then you might consider. But if it's a project of 6 months or less and they're not going to permanently reside there, or even temporary, like if you're not providing housing for them for more than 6 months, then you can keep it the way that you have it currently. But
Okay.
if it's going to be like a year-long project and they're going to reside there, then yeah, you want to do that, because any movement with vehicles and all that could be a part of workers' comp too. Great
There
question.
is some really weird exceptions to that. So
Yeah,
monopolistic states,
yeah,
Ohio is one of them. So Ohio, if you're in Ohio, you have workers' comp through the state. And when someone goes and works in another state, even if it's a short amount of time, in certain states, the Ohio workers' comp transfers and there's coverage. Other ones, even if you're there for only a couple of weeks, you need to purchase literally a separate policy because you can't purchase it through the state. So there is a couple weird. I think there's what, Mick, three: Wyoming, Ohio, and North
yeah,
Dakota or something like that are the
yeah,
three that are monopolistic. So those are the ones with a little asterisk next to that answer.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, knowing the state requirements matter. And I'll say it, these are the words of Mick and Mick only. The moral of the story is, don't live in Ohio. Don't have a business in Ohio. It's weird up there.
Well, so going back to Brandon, he's in Alabama. So he's saying he's being exempt from requiring workers' comp does not exempt his liability. Is it worth it to self-insure?
So Brendan, what do you do? What's your business? Like, what type of business do you have?
He's in
And I
yeah,
can further give,
RV service. I was just about to speak for you, Brandon, but yeah, so he's an RV service. So he services RVs
how many employees do you have, Brendan?
for.
I would consider it, even if you're exempt from the state, because the state doesn't say that you have to have it yet. I, I, mm, you're in a dangerous business there, Brendan. You're in a dangerous business. I would at least consider it. I'm never going to tell you that you have to, but my professional opinion is I would definitely look at it for sure.
Thank you. And then one more quick question. So Joe is asking, is Florida expensive compared to other states?
Yep.
Yep.
Joe, I used to live there. My first business, I started in Florida. So I lived in Florida for 12 years, and all lines of business, Joe. Obviously, on your personal line side, right? Your home, your auto, expensive, general liability, workers' comp, property in Florida, it's expensive. And you can thank attorneys that make it very easy to file lawsuits and claims. Yep.
Interesting. Well, working with you guys, I know Florida is your favorite state to work with. So. Brandon is
It's easy to
asking,
file claims in Florida.
yeah. What is the least expensive insurance state?
Where Brendan lives.
Alabama. All right.
Alabama,
There you go.
Mississippi, um, Georgia away from the coast. Believe it or not, Kentucky. So, like, if you're a fan of the SEC, like most of those states except Florida.
Good way to look at it. Got a
There you
football
go.
over here. So love that. All right, Mick, sorry, back to you. I'll let you take it from here.
No, no, these are amazing questions. Like, I love all of these questions. So, again, what to ask from the insurance company, right? Not your agent, but of the company, because again, to Andrew's point, if you are insured by the state, there's going to be different requirements. And a lot of times, like if you're in Texas and you're insured with Texas Mutual, and I don't know if we have any Texans here or anyone that has a Texas Mutual policy, even though Texas Mutual is a company, a carrier, it's actually run through the state. And so you'll see a lot of different requirements in Texas if you have Texas Mutual. The great thing about the state of Texas is you don't have to have the state program. You can choose others. They just make it a little more easier to go through Texas Mutual, which is the state-run company. But you just want to make sure that you're asking those questions and understanding what am I required to do based on where I live. And obviously, your agent should know those questions, but it's things that different carriers have different rules in different states. Um, Another thing are subcontractors covered. We kind of hit on this earlier. If they lack their own policy and you don't have any type of agreements, then you are probably going to be forced to cover them. And that usually happens at audit time. And I'll give you this example because I've seen it happen 8 times out of 10, especially when we're talking about in the construction arena. So when it comes time for audit, right? And on the application, we ask about who your subcontractors are, the payroll that you have, and all of that. We see this happen so often where, I had, I'll make this up. I had $100,000 of W-2 payroll, and then I had $1 million of subcontractor cost, right? Subcontractor costs, maybe not payroll, but the cost. Well, because I didn't verify that they had insurance. I didn't have a hold harmless agreement or any type of paperwork that is signed that says they are taking and assuming their own risk for workers' comp, even if there's no claims. If that paperwork doesn't exist, that that cost is going to go to your policy and you're going to see a huge premium increase. So I know earlier we talked about someone having 60 subcontractors. This is why I'm telling you to have your own, that they should have their own policy and that you should consider having a program for them to make sure that you are covered, because you don't want 60 subcontractors and their costs to go into your payroll. And I've seen it happen before where someone's workers' comp policy was literally $30,000 before audit. Audit came and they had a bill for $165,000. And that is the God's honest truth. I see that happen so often, and it's just because I'll say as business owners, sometimes we get lazy, right? And we assume that our subcontractors have insurance, but we don't confirm it. You want to confirm and be added as an additional insured, right? That way you know that you are completely protected. So at a minimum, get added as an additional insured and have them send you that endorsement to keep on your file, because you are going to get audited, especially if you're in any type of contracting business. I'd say retail business, restaurant, you're going to get audited every year, right? And they're going to ask a lot of questions. And if you're in something where there's a lot of subcontractors, they're going to audit your subcontractor agreements. And that's where I see most audited premium or additional premium occur. And it is ginormous. And a lot of times you can't argue it, right? And so we always tell all of our partners on the front end, let's make sure that we're doing this. And if you have the right agent, they should handle that for you. So it shouldn't be something, Joe, that you have to do, or Brandon, that you have to do, or any of you have to do. But you just want to make sure that you are explicitly covered under your subcontractors, because you don't want audit to happen and then all of their sub costs get added to your premium, right? And then another thing is understanding what exclusions are on your policy. So believe it or not, everyone in here has an insurance policy. I don't care if it's your homeowners, your auto, your general liability, whatever. I want you to take some time and actually look at your policy. The first, what, Andrew, 7 or 8 pages of this 100-page document, talk about all the beautiful things, right? Here's what's covered. Here's your premium. Here's how much you owe, blah, 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 blah. Those other 97 pages talk about everything that's not covered under your policy. So there is so much more that's not covered than there actually is covered. And the good thing is you can buy most of that back, meaning you can get coverage for a lot of things that are uncovered, but your base policy usually is 65% exclusions, things that are not covered. So I can't tell you what's excluded on your policy. Just know that there's a lot. And I don't need you to go through your policy. I just want you to, everybody grab a policy, not at this moment, grab a policy and humor yourself and see how much is actually excluded from your insurance policy. Right. And then the big one, how are premiums calculated? So we all know, obviously, payroll, right? Payroll is the driving factor of your workers' comp policy, but also the classification. So here's the thing, and here's where I see a lot go wrong. And so when I talk about the effect that we have with getting money back and big checks for our partners is the classification. So I'm going to make this up, right? Brandon, I'm going to use you as an example. So Brandon owns a electric company, an electric repair, electric service company, right? Brendan has 10 employees and his payroll's $500,000. The lazy agent is going to take Brendan's 10 employees and $500,000 and put all of that in electrical repair, which has a much higher rate than salesperson and admin and office manager, right? Those are much lower rates. So if Brendan were paying $30,000 for workers' comp, we're going to come in and classify everybody correctly. So I'm going to ask Brendan, so out of your 10 employees, what do they all do? And what percentage of the time are they doing clerical work versus them out in the field? Because all of that matters. And I might be able to save Brendan $5,000 to $7,000 on his worker comp by asking the right questions. So payroll is critically important, but it's the classifications that most people go wrong. So the next time you're talking to your agent or at the renewal of your worker comp policy, or if you're getting worker comp for the first time, don't just give a payroll number. Make sure you're explaining what all of those people do, right? So if I've got $100,000 of clerical payroll, make sure that you're telling that because you're going to save yourself a lot of money, and you're going to be covered the correct way. So classifications matter. Your claims history matters. In workers' comp, there's something that's called an experience mod rate, right? And the lower that number, the better your premium is going to be, and that changes every year, right? So it's taking your losses, your actual losses versus your expected losses. And if you can be better than expected within your classification, then you're going to get a lower rate. So it's really important to understand claims history, and again, that's where classification really matters. And so that's what I wanted to hit on that piece. Megan, I don't know if we have any questions there before I go into, I'll say, the last part of the day.
Mick, really quick, from just a question of mine. Earlier you mentioned that it was based on where the employee resides. So
Correct.
like on the East Coast, I mean, maybe you live in New Jersey, but you work in New York. So
Yep.
so that's still based on New Jersey because that's where the employee lives, even though they may have gotten hurt in New York?
Correct.
Okay, great.
Correct.
Thank you.
So it's based on where the employee resides. So again, understanding a little bit more into what we talked about, the rating factors. So again, we talked about payroll, we talked about the classification, the experience mod and claims history. One of the things I wanted to talk about with experience modification is average is 1.0. 1.0 on your experience mod is average. Doesn't mean good. I can't tell you how many customers that we have or partners that we get. They're like, yep, I've got a 1.2 mod or I've got a 1.4 mod. They know their number, right? The experience mod. And then we have to hurt their heart. Like, yeah, you're at a 1.2, but you should be at a 0.7. So that means you're paying a lot more than you should be. And here's how we can control those prices. So understanding that 1.0 is just average. If you can be below 1.0, you're saving money. And there are things that you can do to see how things are handled to lower those costs for you. Another thing that we talk about are the policy features. So lowering your deductible or increasing your deductible can lower your premium. Looking at your coverage options to make sure you have what you specifically need. We talked about state regulations, but when we talk about cash flow, here's something that Andrew, Matt, and I wholeheartedly believe, and we want to make sure that you understand this too. If you're with the carrier that offers what you hear called pay-as-you-go workers' comp, you want to take that. What that means is we're taking your real-time actual payroll and you're paying what you're supposed to pay versus me telling Joe, okay, Joe, your estimate for the year is $50,000 and that's your premium. Well, if you're paying by your actual payroll, you might realize that there's seasonality, right? And so, yep, I have more employees now than I do in June. And so in June, I'm going to pay a lower amount for workers' comp. So you can control the cash flow instead of just saying, here's $50,000 divided by 12 and pay. If you know that you have fluctuation, you want to be able to pay that way. And it saves you at audit time because we're doing it on your actual payroll, which means that at the end of the year, all we have to do is ask you about your subs because we know what you paid in your payroll. If you tell us that your payroll is going to be $100,000, but at the end of the year, at the end of the policy period, we see that that payroll was actually $150,000, you have to pay a difference, right? When we see your actual payroll, you're just paying your actual payroll. So, pro tip from Andrew, Matt, and I is if you're with a company or carrier that offers pay as you go, 100 times out of 100, we're going to recommend if you don't pay in full, that's what you do. And a lot of times we will tell our customers for workers' comp, actually don't pay in full, depending on the business that you're in, right? All of our contractors, we never advise to pay in full. We always do pay as you go, even if you can afford to pay in full, because there's always going to be that fluctuation there. So best pro tip today, if you're offered pay as you go, definitely do that. Pay as you go installment plans, again, it's cool, but I'm gonna always go pay as you go if it's offered. If it's not offered, then installment plans are there, and we're gonna say be proactive with your payroll update. So if I'm on an installment plan and I know that I've got an increase or even a decrease in payroll, I'm gonna have that conversation with my agent so that we can adjust some figures. So really important to know that piece. Andrew, anything you want to add to pay as you go or anything?
No, we just had a quick question about whether you get a refund if you overpay. And the important thing, Joe, is to ask for a audit. You see this thing right there asking for an annual audit. So if you don't get audited, you don't get a refund. So you want to make sure you request those.
Yeah, and Joe, what I would tell you to do specifically with this audit is what's called loss runs, LOSSRUNS. So loss runs. You want to have your carrier, your company, or your agent get your last 3 to 5 years of loss runs. And what that is that's your claims history. And then you also want to have them run at the same time your workers' comp worksheets for that same period. And what that's going to do, Joe, is say, okay, here are the claims that Joe actually had. Here's what we estimated. And did we close the claims on time? So, Joe, when we get back decent sized refund checks, and this could be anywhere from $5,000 to $200,000, right? What we do is we go back and look at claims and what's called reserves. So, Joe, you might have had a claim on workers' comp that was only $20,000 in the claim. What insurance companies do, it's almost like when you go check in at a hotel or rent a car, right? Like, we're going to authorize more than the actual agreement, but we're not going to charge it. We're just going to authorize. Well, insurance companies do the same thing with claims. So the moment that there's a claim, depending on what the claim is, there's a number that they say we're going to put this amount in reserves to pay this claim. And the reserves are always more than what the payables are. Well, insurance companies are sometimes slow to close out the reserve, but that reserve number shows on your report. And so we go through and look at every claim that you've had to make sure that, hey, if this was a $20,000 claim, we need to close the reserves because Joe is being charged an extra $30,000. And that is the number that drives up when we talked about your experience mod, Joe. That's the number, the claims number that drives that number up. And we're typically able to go in if you have claims and look at that and say, okay, there's some money owed back to Joe because you've been charging him incorrectly. And then the companies go in and fix it. And that's where you get the refund from. So when we talk about the audit, you want to audit the classifications, the employees in the states, and then make sure that the claims, if you had any, are actually closed out versus having a reserve number.
Thank you, Mick.
Great
And one
question.
quick question from Brandon. So in regards to the pay as you go, is it monthly or quarterly that you're kind of updating the report?
So it's monthly, Joe,
Okay.
and sometimes if you pay bi-weekly, some carriers can do it bi-weekly. So what they're going to do is tie to your payroll company. And
Okay.
so they're going to look at what your payroll was for this payroll period or this month, and it's going to be an automatic thing. So it's set up on the back end, like if you use ADP or whoever your payroll company is, they're going to essentially link to that and know what the payroll is for you, and then also then link to withdraw as well.
Great, thank you. I know that we're getting super close on time here, but a couple more questions, and then Mick, I'll let you kind of wrap it up with your final words. But quick question. So Joe is asking, do we have recommendations for workers' comp carriers that we prefer through Wealth Factory that have the pay-as-you-go for Florida? Yes, Joe. So this amazing team right here, Engineered Insurance Services, they would be able to help you guys. Correct, Andrew and Mick, you guys offer that for Florida. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So Joe, these are this is a great team, great contact, and we can certainly get you connected with the team here as well. And then Todd is asking any concerns that he should have with having employees and work comp coverage through a PEO,
Uh, Todd, what's your business?
professional handyman service.
Yes, Todd. I would say you definitely don't want I shouldn't say you never want to go through a PEO. That's why I asked what your business is. With some businesses, PEO actually makes sense. And sometimes the stage that we're in within our business, a PEO makes sense. But your PEO professionals are definitely payroll people. They're not insurance people. Just like we're insurance people, not payroll people, right? So like I can't give you advice on payroll, even though I know the names of ADP and all the other payroll companies. We're not payroll experts, and most payroll companies will tell you that they're not insurance experts, especially worker comp experts. So yeah, Joe, or Todd, I would definitely say it's time to look elsewhere for you for sure.
Great. And do y'all work with DBA insurance, Defense Base Act insurance?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. All right, Mick, I'm going to let you kind of close this out here. And again, if anybody has any additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat the link to get connected to the team here at Engineered Insurance Services. And so y'all can always, if you have any additional questions, we can do that. We can also, like Mick said, have a second session if that's something that y'all want. But Mick, I'll just pass this back off to you.
Yeah, I mean, again, very passionate about insurance, but in particular, workers' comp for me personally. So if there's any questions, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. You don't have to be a partner of ours. Like, I love just the education piece. So if there's any questions that you have, definitely reach out. And Megan, I'd love to do, a second part because there are some other things that I think the group, with all the amazing, great questions that everyone's had, like, I'd love to continue this. If you'll have us.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we're currently working on the sessions or the schedule for 2025. So we can get this, yeah, get something scheduled for sure. So If there are any additional questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And if not, Mick, Andrew, Matt, thank you so much for being here. I love how y'all lead with education. That's how we, approach all of our curriculum and coaching at Wealth Factory. So we truly appreciate y'all's partnership and your time and wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you all.
Thanks for having us. We
Yeah,
appreciate
for
it.
having
All
us.
right. Thanks. We'll be talking soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.